Okay, good afternoon, dear colleagues. Let us start. Let's not wait anymore. So it is my great pleasure to open this, I would say, like a special session of our East European / Ukrainian Studies colloquium. Of course, we're all very happy that Professor Magocsi joined us today. My plan is like that. I'll do a very brief introduction of our guest. Then we'll listen to his talk. Actually, I have no idea what we are supposed to listen, but it will be somehow related to Babyn Yar and its legacies, whatsoever. And then, of course, we'll have a discussion round, which is like open to all of us, absolutely. Before doing that, of course, I feel like my obligation to express gratitude. Yeah, first and foremost, of course, to Ukrainian Jewish Encounter. That's a very interesting initiative, very important initiative that, as you could imagine from the name, from the title, strives to promote dialogue between, let's say, Ukrainian Jewish narratives, Ukrainian Jewish memory, people who are doing Ukrainian studies and Jewish studies. And I would also like to share with you warm words from the president of our university, Professor Edward Müller. He's unfortunately unable to join us today, but he'll meet Professor Magocsi tomorrow, and he's sending his best greetings to all of us on this occasion. And now, maybe some of you don't know me, I hope, of course not, but let me also briefly introduce myself. So my name is Andrii Portnov. I'm here at the Viadrina, Professor of Entangled History of Ukraine. As I just told our guest, it's so far the only professorship in Germany which has History of Ukraine in its title. And actually, we are doing this colloquium for some years together with our friends and partners from the chair of KGME, so Cultures and History of East Central Europe, Professor Beneke. And this semester actually is the first semester when we return to presence, so like physical presence, not online format. And that's like double pleasure, to have you here.
Just this semester?
Just this semester, just this semester. So not like we are, Zoom from Canada or whatever, but, like physically in Frankfurt, Oder. That's, of course, our great pleasure. Now, dear colleagues, let me very briefly, maybe not very, but briefly, introduce our guest, even though he deserves a long, introduction and biography for sure, a book, critical biography. So, Robert Magocsi was born on, if I may give the date to our colleagues, it is not a secret, so 26th of January 1945 in New Jersey, United States. So his education, as bachelor education, he was at Rutgers University, and then it was Princeton, so master dissertation and PhD in 1972, if I'm not mistaken. And since 1980, try to imagine this, time frame. Since 1980, he's the John Yarenko Chair of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Toronto. So that's a pretty, long time. So many things happened. Polish Solidarność, right? The dissolution of the Soviet Union, all the mass movements in Ukraine,
The invasion of the Soviet Union of Czechoslovakia.
The invasion
in 1968,
of Czechoslovakia.
I was present.
Exactly.
My brothers came
present.
from the East.
That's right. So.
And you missed one very important one, the whole decade in Harvard.
You could add this, Harvard, of course. Everybody needs to mention.
It's true that Princeton is more important than Harvard.
You see? Very good.
So correct.
Glad to hear that. That was intentional.
You did well.
So, Professor Magocsi also taught and researched in Jerusalem, Prešov, and last but not least, Halle, among others, at Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology.
Yeah, that's right.
And
10 years.
10 years, actually. 10 years.
Over a 10-year period.
Now I'm going to give you, if I may, dear colleagues, to give you some titles, not all the titles, some titles of the books Professor Magocsi published or edited, right? And I think that you'll feel from this list the scope of problems, terrains and questions under analysis. Again, not all of them, but just some. So the first one, I've decided to start with this one, if I may, 1978. I was not born when the book appeared yet. The Shaping of a National Identity, Subcarpathian Rus, 1848-1948. I think this book is very important because our guest is often called, and he also called himself several times, the Skomer as a nation builder. So a person who is not just a historian, but also an active participant, if I may say so, in building the fourth East Slavic nation, the Carpathian Rusians, which is not the topic for today, but still, let's not forget about it. 1983, Galicia, a historical survey and bibliography guide. Still very relevant publication. For those of us who is doing the history of West Ukraine, Galicia, it's very valuable publication. 1986, Ukraine, a historical atlas. 1993, historical atlas of Central Europe, then republished several times, among others 2018. Dear Professor Magocsi, please believe me, last week we've had another colloquium, non-Ukrainian topic, and a young lady who presented her research showed maps from your atlas. Seriously, it was like it was a pure coincidence, which actually shows how important this publication was and still is for our field.
And it's now being published in Turkish.
Ah, you see, now being published in Turkish. Very good. Now, 1989, symbolic year, of course, for all of us. Professor Magocsi edited, so at first he organized the conference and then edited a volume, very valuable volume called Morality and Reality, the Life and Times of Andrii Portnov. It's one of the most important book publications about the very famous, let's say, figure of Ukrainian and Polish history of the Greek Catholic Church. 1996, A History of Ukraine, the Land and its People, first edition, then second edition 2010. That's the book I'm always recommending also to my students. One could say that that's an attempt, a very successful attempt, of creating a profound multinational history of Ukraine based on territorial approach. Okay, so it's not just the history of Ukrainians, but the history of all major ethnic national groups who lived and still live on Ukrainian territory. Highly valuable publication. And then let me name also some books that are not kind of related to Ukraine per se. 1999, Encyclopedia of Canada's People. 2002, Aboriginal Peoples of Canada. Then 2007, Ukrainian Illustrated History. It's kind of like a small version of this huge book about Ukrainian people with very interesting illustrations. Again, not just Ukrainian national past, but also pictures about the Jewish past, the Crimean Tatar past, the Polish past, which is very important indeed. And the two last titles, because believe me, there are much, much more. So 2014, right before the Russian invasion, right? Book called This Blessed Land, Crimea and the Crimean Tatars. It's one of the best synthetic, short histories of the peninsula, and it's complicated, complex history. And 2016, this one, Jews and Ukrainians, A Millennium of Coexistence, together with Yohanan Petrovsky-Stern, who actually was our guest earlier, but online. So for Yohanan, it was online. Ukrainian Studies online colloquium, so you're lucky in this sense. And now, if I may, I would like to share with you, using this opportunity, some of my own reflections from two my personally favorite texts by Professor Magocsi. I'm sure he has no idea which text I'm going to mention. So the first one is called The Ukrainian National Revival, a New Analytical Framework. It was first published in 1989 and in Ukrainian translation in 1991. And believe me or not, dear colleagues, I remember myself being a student of history in the University of Dnipro many years ago. I've read this article. It was actually the time when everybody was interested in, national revival, nationalist movements, Benedict Anderson, Miroslav Groch, stuff like that. And it impressed me a lot, and I decided to reread it yesterday and found a quote I would like to share with you, if I may, very briefly, because it somehow, corresponds to what's going on nowadays. So let me quote Professor Magocsi from 1989. What I believe would be useful is to avoid the kind of historical predeterminism and to look at the phenomenon of nationalism or the national revival in Ukrainian lands on its own terms and not from any preconceived notion whereby the only criterion for judging the movement is whether it evolved progressively toward a future classless society or toward an independent and territorially unified Ukrainian nation state. As a corollary, it would also be useful to reject the idea of uniqueness, though a popular approach, especially to non-Marxist Ukrainian historians, and to place the Ukrainian movement in the context of other European national revivals. In this article, we have the suggestion to use the notion of the hierarchy of multiple loyalties. I've had a lecturer who was very happy about this idea, and again, in our, let's say, Dnipro, which only started being an open city after the period of, Cold War closedness and all this Soviet propaganda, it was really something very new and innovative and interesting. And I should tell you, of course, I've never believed, and I would never expect that after some time I would moderate Professor Magocsi in Germany. It was not planned at all. And the second text is in Ukrainian. It was published in 2013 in the leading Ukrainian historical journal, Ukrainский историчный журнал. And it was a very short, couple of pages, professor's response to an article by two very important Ukrainian Kyiv historians, Alexei Tolochko and Georgy Kasyanov, who suggested to move away from national history and national narratives and stuff like that. And I really liked the way Professor Magocsi responded to them, and especially to the idea that Cambridge history of Russia could be used as, as a good example of this, overcoming, and kind of rhetorically asking, okay, then guys, show us this new non-national whatever approach, and as far as we know, it was not shown until today, so the question remains open. Dear Paul Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, by the way, for the surprises. I'm always curious what sticks in people's heads, because as many of you know, who yourself, faculty members, young students, graduate students, whatever you write, you don't know what's going to happen to it, and what people find interesting and not interesting. So this was a fascinating, semi-nostalgic trip for me, and I appreciate it. Hopefully it wasn't too long for the audience, and I don't think so, but it was quite interesting. So I appreciate that very much, and I'm very pleased to be here today. In one sense, the subject of the talk today, one can feel a little bit uncomfortable when we are dealing with a subject, a territory, a land that is at the present in its a very difficult state, to say the least. A country at war, and we're talking about the historical past. At one level, one can feel a little bit uncomfortable, but on the other hand, what I chose to do here is not to talk about necessarily details of events of the historical past, but rather historical memory. And of course, we know that that is a subject unto itself, and because historical memory is a living thing, it is something that is based on things of the past, people remember from the past, but then make use of that past in the present and continue to make use of that past, and will continue to make use of that past in the future. So much for the need to proclaim relevance for what I'm going to say today. The specific element or the specific subject of the historical memory is Babyn Yar, this ravine outside of Kyiv, or just to the west-northwest of the city center. And it's in the context of a new book, a book that's just coming out in its scholarly form, called Babyn Yar, History and Memory. First and foremost, this is not a book solely about the events of September 29th, 30th, when the Wehrmacht arrived in Kyiv, and soon after its arrival was the destruction of the 33,000 plus Jews in 2 days on September 29th, September 30th, 1941. Is that discussed? Are those events discussed in this book? Yes, there's a very long chapter about that. But the rest of the book actually is about Babyn Yar as a physical place before World War II, because it has its own history before World War II, and even its physical topography is discussed. And then after the so you have the kind of pre-World War II section, then you have your World War II section, and then we have what we would call, to quote the Romanian historian Nicolae Iorga, Byzance après Byzance. Here we have Babyn Yar after Babyn Yar. And so the rest of the book is filled with chapters on, there's a chapter on historical memory, a chapter on literature, a chapter on cinema, various aspects of how, in art, of how Babyn Yar has been remembered, talked about, written about, depicted, etc. And then the last two chapters deal with the problem of memorialization of this physical space. And what I want to share with you today, as perhaps a beginning of a discussion, are the concluding remarks in this volume, which is actually called In Lieu of an Afterword. And I wrote on the board over there in the old-fashioned manner, and I have no pictures with me or any of the other kind of stuff. This is an old-fashioned lecture from an old-fashioned person, even though I could do this, but would never deign to do it. You'd never see me on Zoom anyway, but unlike my colleague, Johanna Petrovsky-Stan, who's out there on the Zoom cutting edge. So sorry about that. You just got me in person with paper and talk, like in the old days. The 75th anniversary of September 1941, and I wrote only a few things on the board because I couldn't remember certain things. So this, the 75th anniversary of the September 1941 massacre of Jews of Kyiv prompted a renewed interest in the question of memorialization. The first body to act on this matter was actually the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, which you've just heard about. This is this non-governmental organization based in Toronto, Canada. And nothing was even planned or done for this yet, for the 75th anniversary. So this organization set out already in late 2014, 2 years before, to prepare a major week-long commemorative event to culminate on the 29th and 30th of September 2016. That is the 75th anniversary of what we now know as the Holocaust by bullets carried out against Kyiv's Jewry at the ravine of Babyn Yar. This commemoration, organized, sponsored, paid for by the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, took place under the patronage of the President of Ukraine, at the time Petro Poroshenko, and the patronage of the World Jewish Congress. And that was in cooperation with a wide range of government and non-governmental bodies within Ukraine and certainly beyond Ukraine. And this commemoration, this week-long commemoration, had four aspects to it. One was education and consciousness raising among youth. So about 200 young people from all parts of Ukraine were brought to Kyiv to not only experience this, but in preparation, write essays about Babyn Yar and so forth. So that was one thing, dealing with youth, always from many perspectives should be and is the most important thing. The second aspect of this week-long thing was a public symposium to discuss the results of research that eventually were published in this book. The third aspect, or project, or program, was a commemorative concert at the National Opera in Kyiv. By the way, the National Opera House was closed the whole week because it was for the rehearsals, because we brought in, actually from Germany, the Hamburg Symphony Orchestra, that performed a work called Babyn Yar by a Ukrainian composer, and then what should be the last work that has no political connotation whatsoever, and the last work sung by the Dumka choir with the Hamburg Symphony Orchestra was Brahms' Requiem. Perfect. The fourth of these programs during that week was the presentation of awards to an international competition which we began 2 years before, an international competition for landscape design to transform Babyn Yar into a sacred place of memory for future generations and visitors to the site. And this was done under the auspices of the International Association of Architects in Paris. So this was a high-level kind of concours. And at this week-long event, hundreds of students, scholars, public intellectuals, musicians, artists, actors, landscape architects, visitors from Europe, the Middle East, and North America descended upon Kyiv. Took one whole year after that, we should say, we started planning this week in 2014, and we were the first to do something for the 2016. 1 year after we started, in 2015, the President of Ukraine, Poroshenko, issued a decree in November 2015 to create a national organizing committee, and its goal was to propose a state-sponsored commemoration for the 75th anniversary of this. So now finally the government gets on board, at least by issuing a decree. And as we know, with the case of many state commemorations in Ukraine, you can issue decrees all you want. Actually, nothing much was done after this decree until more or less the last moment. And very concretely, not until mid-2016, 2 months before this commemoration was to take place. So finally, the government gets involved with these belated plans, but they were realized so that on the night of the 29th of September 2016, the culmination of our week, the government of Ukraine, led by President Poroshenko, hosted guests from several countries, in particular Israel, Germany, the European Council, at a grandiose event on the grounds of Babyn Yar. Now clearly, these commemorative events were appropriately carried out by both non-governmental, that is, Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, and governmental bodies. But what about Babyn Yar itself? Would these truly ambitious commemorations connected with the 75th anniversary lead to a transformation of Babyn Yar into a place worthy of its status as the Auschwitz of the East, that is the symbol of World War II's, to Europe's Holocaust by bullets? Interestingly, at the very same time that this week-long commemoration events in Kyiv, sponsored by the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, which I've just described, at the very same time that they were taking place, so too were meetings being held that resulted in the formation of something called the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center. Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center. I have to write these names down because they also seem very similar, as you can see the two names up there. So that's why I put them down so both of us can remember. The goal of this center was to build a Babyn Yar Holocaust Museum under the direction of a supervisory board headed by the former Soviet dissident and Israeli politician Natan Sharansky, and including 4 figures who were the project's primary source of funding. And those 4 figures were Michael Friedman, German Khan, Pavel Fuchs, and Viktor Pinchuk. So you have Sharansky and these 4. All 5 of these figures were born in Soviet Ukraine, I'll wait. What are we doing? Oh.
Mind. Talk.
Okay. So, all 5 of these figures, born in Soviet Ukraine, and that fact, according to them, gave them the right to create Jewish memorials in their former homeland, which is now independent Ukraine. Now, in reality, for decades, all but one of these 5 figures lived and worked elsewhere. The politician Sharansky in Israel, the oligarchs Friedman, Khan, and Fuchs in Moscow or in London, as these people do. The leading donor behind the well-funded Babyn Yar Holocaust Center was this Mikhail Friedman, whose business interests and wealth was just like that of Khan and Fuchs, closely related to the Russian Federation and its increasingly autocratic leader, Vladimir Putin. Now, in order to achieve its goals and enhance its prestige on the international scene, this Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center created an international body, or an international scholarly council specifically, and the historical consultant that they hired, there was a lot of money behind this, was the respected Dutch historian Karel Berkhoff, actually a graduate student of mine. But the project also engaged the Moscow-based Russian film director Ilya Krzyzanowski, who was known for his promotion of immersive theater and audience role-playing. To be sure, innovative, yet controversial, artistic, and performance practices. Now, while this Holocaust Memorial Center project was undertaking preliminary research and construction planning, Ukraine's Ministry of Culture, at the behest of President Poroshenko, it commissioned the Institute of History of Ukraine at the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine to prepare a proposal for an all-encompassing Babyn Yar National Memorial Preserve. Note the differences even in the titles here. The result of that initiative was a concept paper submitted in 2018 for a memorial museum to honor the victims at Babyn Yar, and an expanded version 1 year later that included as well a proposal to transform the site into a national historical preserve in the form of a necropolis to honor those buried there. And so, within 2 years, after the 75th anniversary of 2016, there were 2 proposals. 2 proposals about how to transform this site. One was the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center, put forth by an externally funded international body. The other was put forth by the Academy of Sciences Institute of the History of Ukraine through the auspices of Ukraine's Ministry of Culture, and that goal was to create a Babyn Yar National Memorial Preserve. Both projects were ultimately dependent on acceptance by the government of Ukraine, as well as by the administration of the city of Kyiv, which, by the way, owned the land. So you can proclaim what you want, but you got to talk to the landowner. And the landowner was the city of Kyiv. Is still the city of Kyiv. Now, perhaps it is inevitable that if there were 2 projects, there would be a rivalry between them. And indeed, a rivalry did soon develop, in which various stakeholders took sides. Jewish and Ukrainian community organizations and their spokespersons in Ukraine, one of the stakeholders, another, Ukraine's governmental bodies, Another, public intellectuals and the media, both within Ukraine and beyond Ukraine. And another, both the Jewish diaspora and Ukrainian diaspora. So these were all of the stakeholders and very interested in what was going to play itself out in Babyn Yar. This rivalry turned acrimonious after the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center announced the proposed design of their artistic director, this Ilya Krzyżanowski. His goal was to create an atmosphere of hyper-reality in which the visitor, interacting with various monuments, would experience exceptional thoughts and emotions. Krzyżanowski's design provoked a barrage of criticism, in particular from Jews within Ukraine and beyond Ukraine, one of whom wrote for the Wall Street Journal an article entitled "Ukraine's Holocaust Disneyland." So egregious were Krzyżanowski's plans that in April 2020, the academic director of the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center, this Karel Berkhoff from the Netherlands, publicly resigned from the project. And as he said in his resignation, quote, "I used to sense the project had a moral compass, but that is no longer the case." But unfazed by this controversy, this Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center project continued to move forward and to press Ukraine's national government and Kyiv city authorities for formal access, whether that be actual ownership or a long-term lease to the land and buildings at the Babyn Yar site. So the property issue. Now, for its part, that other project, the Academy of Sciences Institute of the History of Ukraine, then undertook a comprehensive revision of its original proposal. Aside from its own collegium of 18 authors, it was headed by the Institute's Deputy Director, Andrii Portnov, also the noted World War II Holocaust and Jewish history specialists Alexander Lysenko, Vitaly Nachmanovich, and Anatoly Podolsky. Aside from them, the Institute engaged the services of 43 scholars worldwide to review and propose changes to the document that they submitted. And it was finally released in 2021 under the title, quote, "Concept for the Memorialization of the Babyn Yar National Historical Memorial Preserve." Now, the concept of the Historical Institute called for the creation of 2 museums, one devoted specifically to the history of Babyn Yar and to all of its victims, Babyn Yar and all of its victims. The other devoted to the Holocaust, but not only in Ukraine, not only in Babyn Yar, and not only in Ukraine, but also the Holocaust in general throughout Europe. So these are the 2 museums that one would have. Comprehensive picture. Central to the proposal of their institute was a memorial park, drawing on ideas from the International Landscape Design Competition in 2016 that would transform the the Babyn Yar killing grounds into a sacred space, a necropolis, where when you go there, you are silent and you know that you don't need all of the other bells and whistles, as one says. Very important, because this is a sacred space. President Poroshenko, whose administration had initiated the work of the Institute of History Project, also welcomed the initiative. He initiated the Historical Institute, but he also welcomed the initiative of the outside-funded Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center. Classic Ukrainian approach. The National Organizing Committee that President Poroshenko, created in 2017 included state functionaries and representatives of both Babyn Yar projects. Cooperation between supporters of the two projects, however, proved impossible. Meanwhile, in the midst of the growing controversy over memorialization at Babyn Yar, the political scene in Ukraine changed radically. The results of the presidential elections in May 2019 brought a new head of state to the country, as we all know, Volodymyr Zelensky, and then he called elections to the parliament, and then his party wins this big majority, and so now he's in control of Ukrainian political life for all intents and purposes. And that changed now the dynamics of the Babyn Yar debate. And that debate, what was the debate? What was the problem here? Well, should the memorialization focus solely on Jews or on all peoples who perished at Babyn Yar during World War II? Should the focus be solely on the Holocaust period or on all tragedies that occurred at Babyn Yar? Should the memorialization be primarily conceived by Jews? Or should experts, regardless of their ethnic or religious background, be involved? And perhaps most sensitive of all, should the project be under the control, didn't make a difference where the money was coming from, that's a different issue, but an important issue, but should the project be under the control of Ukrainian governmental and scholarly bodies, or under the control of those putting up the funds? So these were the crucial issues that led to this controversy between these two projects. Now, since the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center, the first one, was being funded primarily by one person, even though there were four of them, the money was really coming from this Mikhail Friedman. Unending money. And since his investments were tied largely to businesses and financial institutions in the Russian Federation, the Babyn Yar memorialization controversy was reduced to a simple dichotomy. We have the Russian project, and we have the Ukrainian project. By the way, as you'll see in the book, the footnotes to the book describe specifically that Friedman himself, even before the second phase of the war, admitted in an article in the Western press that he was part of the inner circle of Putin, and he would be among those oligarchs who were called in every once in a while for conversation. Right? So this is someone, at the top. It's not just someone wealthy, but... So here we have now the Russian project and the Ukrainian project. Now, the spokespersons for both of those projects turned to President Zelensky and to Kyiv's Mayor Vitaly Klitschko for endorsement. Jewish activists in Ukraine were divided. Several religious and secular organizations supported the Russian project, while others, calling themselves Ukrainian Jews, which was becoming a very new term, so to speak, and now it's widespread, they, not surprisingly, expressed support for the Ukrainian project. Speaking on behalf of civil society, no less than 800 intellectuals in Ukraine, fearing Russian ideological influence over the Babyn Yar memorialization, expressed adamant opposition to the Russian project. The most representative of diaspora organizations also took sides. The World Jewish Congress chairman, Ronald Lauder, seeking to find accommodation with the Russian project, and the World Ukrainian Congress chairman, Paul Grod, pledging support and funding for an alternative Ukrainian project. But what about the new government leadership in Ukraine? Now what? Where are they going to come down on this one? To be sure, Russia's invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February last year became a profound turning point in modern Ukrainian history. And in that context, it is necessary to note that there was President Zelensky before February 24 and President Zelensky after February 24. Already before the start of this second phase of the war, Zelensky accepted the principle that any memorialization at Babyn Yar should be carried out as a joint venture of the state and the private sector. It was never made clear, however, as to how much control either one of those two parties had over the conceptualization and the implementation of any future project. Now, it's true, without question, that the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center had more than enough financing to pay for the entire memorialization. Whether because of conviction or because of practical realism, Zelensky, with the encouragement of his closest advisors, in particular the presidential chief of staff, Andrii Portnov, favored the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center Russian project. For its part, the Kyiv City Council was opposed to the property demands of the Russian project. But not so the mayor Klitschko. So now the city is divided on this. Klitschko's favoring the Russian project, and the city council says, no, 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 no. Our property, we ain't giving it away to anybody. But consequently, the Zelensky government concluded a memorandum of agreement in July 2021 with the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center, the Russian project. All efforts of the Academy of Sciences Historical Institute, with the help of the Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance, which also was on board of the Ukrainian project, all their efforts seemed to go nowhere. After all, the Historical Institute had originally been commissioned to do its work by Zelensky's now forgotten and actually disgraced predecessor, his turn, Petro Poroshenko. We know he was already subjected to a government-inspired lawsuit. So this is where we are now on the eve of the 80th anniversary. In 2021, in September. Now we have a new flurry of activity. You know, these kruli dati, these round dates, everyone gets all excited. So this is now the 80th, even more important than the 75th in some ways. Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance, his director, Anton Drobovich, outspoken supporter of the Ukrainian project, organized the solemn commemorative ceremony on the evening of the 29th. That is the first day on which Jews were shot dead. Meanwhile, the Russian project had originally planned to complete its Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center by the time of the 80th anniversary. That never happened, but it did manage to erect some interactive monuments and to stage in early October a Krzyżanowski transformative performance. Even more significant was the government's decision through its Ministry of Culture, taken on the last day of 2021, to lease the only remaining historic building on the grounds of Babyn Yar. This was the former office or kontora of the Jewish cemetery. And to lease it to whom? To the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center. It's the Russian project, which promised to create an innovative museum by 2026 at the latest. Then, of course, came February 24th, the invasion. Everything changed. The leading financial backers of the Russian project, Friedman, Khan, Fuchs, publicly compromised. And they're either in Moscow Well, who knows if the Brits let them into London. In such circumstances, one might assume that neither President Zelensky nor any subsequent government would allow a project connected in any way with Russia to operate in Ukraine. So one would assume. And yet, as the Russian-Ukrainian war raged on, President Zelensky met in October 2022 with the chairman of the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center, Natan Sharansky, with the chairman of the World Jewish Congress, Ron Lauder, former U.S. Senator Joe Lieberman, the last of the original 5 oligarch financial backers who remained in Ukraine, Viktor Pinchuk, and with one of Ukraine's chief rabbis, Yaakov Dov Blythe. Urged by his closest advisor, Andrii Portnov, the president reaffirmed his support for the implementation of the Russian project. He made it clear that, quote, we, that is the Ukrainian government, have not forgotten and we definitely must realize this project. And he was referring to the Russian Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial. And so to sum up and conclude, despite the government's ongoing inclination toward the Russian project, the Historical Institute's Ukrainian project remains a viable alternative whenever Ukraine returns to a modicum of peace and stability. Since that is not likely to occur soon, one must, however sadly, repeat the words that one of the authors here, Vitaly Nachman, concludes his piece, quote, that even such a distinguished place of memory as Babyn Yar has still not been commemorated in a worthy manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, dear Professor Magocsi. Dear colleagues, I should admit, as I've said, I have had no idea what exactly we're doing here today, but now I probably have to confess that I am one of those 43 scholars who tried to give some, advices because Andrii Portnov, a good friend of mine, asked to do that. Okay, the floor is open for discussion, questions, disagreements, right? Right. So, please.
I have no position.
So, please don't be shy, dear colleagues, and it's always, of course, my
for the first question will come, exactly, and then eventually, who knows, they won't ask maybe some other topics, but let's begin with this one.
So,
the gentleman back there, please.
Yeah, please, Tim,
Yeah, thank you for the very informative talk. I don't know if it's very much about this whole issue. My question would be, could you contextualize a bit the second project, the one you call the Ukrainian project, against the policy of the Poroshenko period of the Institute of National Memory and so on?
Mm-hmm.
Because you highlighted much more the other project, so what's the nature of the Ukrainian project?
So the basic thrust of the Ukrainian project, and I will say what I can remember, and since my colleague to my right is one of those who had read the project and commented on it.
No, just commented. No.
What, excuse me, wait a minute, did you hear that? I said he read the project and then commented on it. And he said, well, no, I just commented, which he didn't even read the project. Well, that's very good. That sounds like a lot of scholars. That's okay. Okay, so, not to put you on the spot, but you may fill in what I miss or what I can't remember. The basic thrust of the Ukrainian project vis-a-vis the Russian, and without doing the contrast only, but then to say something about the Ukrainian project, is that the focus is not simply which is really what Friedman wanted, to focus solely on the events that took place in September 1941 in Babyn Yar, and very specifically, therefore, the annihilation and the murder of Jews. That is the thrust of that project. The Ukrainian project is not discounting in any way the importance of that dastardly two-day event, but is concerned that as a national preserve, memorial preserve, that this area become both a place of respect, like when one goes to a cemetery, right? So the physical setting should be the necropolis, but the museum component should not simply focus on those events of the Holocaust, and specifically in Kyiv, but the phenomena of what the Holocaust is within Ukraine and within Europe, because as an educative tool, people need to know the broad sweep of this, and as well the history of Jews living on the territory of Ukraine from when they started coming until the present. So two things were different here. And by the way, great concern for all of those others who were killed at Babyn Yar after September 29, 30th. This was tens of thousands of Soviet POWs died there, starved to death in the Sirets camp right alongside. Roma, the small community, but nonetheless, were deliberately annihilated there. Some Ukrainian nationalist activists, and we can go on and on. Clearly, the main group, if you will, of people that were killed were Jews, but far from only. And so it's in that context that even looking at Babyn Yar has to be looked at in a larger framework. And then the history of, by the way, there was a major mudslide 20 years after that, et cetera, et cetera. So that, I would suggest, is the main thrust of the difference between the two. The content is different, as well as the manner of memorializing the space. Radically different. Have you remembered anything else that I haven't?
Maybe I will not do
Fine.
like a lot of commenting now.
Fine,
Because
okay.
we have, it's such a good occasion to have you, you know.
Fine,
the video.
okay,
We could
fine.
discuss it at some point also with my students.
This?
I was surprised, I should just admit, I've never heard this number of 43. It's interesting for me to know that, you know, it was really like a very broad group.
Oh yeah, I counted them, and they were, well,
Very good.
it was published, you know,
Very
this is
good.
visible.
Because as far as I remember, my suggestion, they were just, you know, like how this museum could be done, keeping in mind the museum in Dnipro. We have a new
Right.
one,
Yeah.
so Museum of Ukrainian Jews, the entire
Yeah.
history.
The point of this is that they went out of their way
Exactly.
to get opinions from scholars and activists, and not only scholars, also some activists, you know, public figures, intellectuals, etc., worldwide. That was the point. And they got it. And they did the revise on the basis of it.
Yeah, very good. So I've seen Dagmara's question, right? Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. During your speech, I remember to some discussions also in Poland about some project of museums. So like this variety ideas between European context of museum and specifically Polish
Correct.
tragedy and victim. But my question is why first 2014 and not 2019 11 for the 70th anniversary. Why so late? What was the story of the starting a discussion so late?
Well, there is an entire chapter in here devoted to the history of commemorations at Babyn Yar. And the first very important one, well, under the Soviets you couldn't do this, but nonetheless, Jews would go there in September 29th, 30th, and on one occasion, I believe it was 1970, Ivan Zuba, the very important Ukrainian dissident, he came and he spoke in public, in Ukrainian language, and called for the need to commemorate specifically Jews, because it's not like the Soviets then built a monument, but it was, to people who died during World War II, all vagueness, as was the Soviet want. So it's not like there was nothing that was done before independent Ukraine, already during the Soviets, but nothing could be built except this one Soviet monument. Then after independent Ukraine, actually, this physical space of Babyn Yar almost became a free-for-all, because there was no control, and groups came and just built whatever monuments they wanted. So, there's a Russian Orthodox chapel there, and a monument to 2 or 3 monks, I believe. Then there's a small monument to a Ukrainian nationalist, Olena Taliha, whose main boulevard was there. There was for a while a gypsy wagon to symbolize.
It's still there.
And yeah, well, some of these things are still there, some of these things are not. I think they took away the gypsy wagon and just left the stone. Then they also had plans. That's right, this is discussed. It wasn't the World Jewish Congress, it was the other one, the Jewish Joint Organization, sometime, I believe, in the mid-90s, or agreed to help fund a monument, help fund a museum. And then there was controversy among the Jews themselves as to what this museum should be like. And all they did was put up a monument on the spot where the museum was supposed to be, but never happened. So, there were all of these kinds of things happening on the site of Babyn Yar with no order whatsoever. And that is why when the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter came into being, and its goal was to work together to commemorate Jews and Ukrainians, let's put it this way, to Jews and all Ukrainians, amongst Jews are also Ukrainians if they live in Ukraine, that when they took the initiative, then these guys came on board at the same time. You saw that movement was happening. So it's not like nothing was happening before, but the thrust of it came in 2014, and then we started in 2014, and they came on 2016 for the 75th. It was clear that something's going to happen, and now these oligarchs came in and said we have to do this as well. So.
Sure.
You sometimes say Ukrainian Jews, sometimes Ukrainians and Jews. So my question is rather about the identity of Jews. So when do they identify themselves as Ukrainian Jews? Or is there a group of Jews living in Ukraine or somehow like being connected to Ukraine but not really like describing themselves that way?
Okay, I slipped. Whenever I did say more than once, Ukrainians and Jews, because I'm stuck with this title. See, it's this book's fault. Pardon. It's the title of the book's fault, but not the content. Inside the book, I never referred to Jews, or we never referred to Jews. Pardon. We never refer to Ukrainians, we always say ethnic Ukrainians. Why? Because everybody who lives on the territory of Ukraine is Ukrainian. And it doesn't make a difference what their ethno-national background is. And one can speak of Polish Ukrainians, Jewish Ukrainians, Russian Ukrainians, Hungarian Ukrainians, Crimean Tatar Ukrainians, and ethnic Ukrainians. The problem is that distinction is frequently never made. And then, you know, when you say Ukraine, what are you talking about? Are you talking about people who are ethnic Ukrainians, and people who are ethnic Ukrainians are those who speak the Ukrainian language, have a sense of belonging to the Ukrainian ethnos, right? Whereas all of the other people are also Ukrainians in the sense of belonging to the state. So I slipped. I shan't do it again. And thank you for keeping me on my toes. Now, with regard to Jews, up until recently, there were only Russian Jews in Ukraine or from Ukraine. First of all, another important thing. If you live in a country, you don't identify yourself as anything other than, I live here and I'm from such and such a place. It's only when you go outside of the country that you're asked and you're forced by circumstances to identify yourself. And so you use some kind of identity. And as we know from somebody who wrote an article and talked about the importance of multiple identities among people everywhere in the world, right? And not only national multiple identities, but all kinds of identities, right? There's a choice that's made. And without question, the vast majority of Jews traditionally who had come from the territory of Ukraine, this is the vast majority of, let's say, Jews in Israel today or in North America. They call themselves Russian Jews. Or Jews were from Russia. Or, no, they actually called Russian Jews. That's the way it has been. The idea of using the term Ukrainian Jew is something quite recent, and it is a phenomenon of certain Jewish activists who openly ascribe to the principle or the concept of, everyone in Ukraine is Ukrainian, and we happen to be Jewish Ukrainians as opposed to Polish Ukrainians, etc. And now actively use that term. People like Zissels, people like Podolsky. This is where this term has come. It's quite recent. I believe, I don't know, no one knows. Someday we will know. First of all, the number of Jewish Ukrainians has decreased, especially since the second phase of the war. Like, the numbers of everybody in Ukraine have decreased for all of the reasons we know. But there are still Jewish Ukrainians living in Ukraine. And as a result of the events of the second phase of the war in particular, let alone the first phase, this idea of using the term Jewish Ukrainian is now, or Ukrainian Jews, right? Ukrainian Jews, is becoming much more accepted. And I say, how accepted, we don't really know, because one hasn't carried out sociological studies. The group is small enough that you could do it, but this is not the time. But it seems that is the thrust. A new phenomenon, a new terminology, a more correct terminology, that is becoming more and more widespread, is how I'd answer that.